February 3rd, 1998, 6:45 p.m., Huntsville Unit, Texas. The execution chamber falls silent as Karla Faye Tucker takes her final breath. Outside, cameras from around the world capture this historic moment. The first woman executed in Texas since the Civil War. But what the cameras couldn't capture was the journey that led to this moment, or the words she spoke that would divide a nation. Just minutes before the lethal injection began, Tucker looked directly at the families of her victims and said something that stunned everyone in that room. "I am so sorry. I hope God will give you peace with this." Then, as the deadly chemicals coursed through her veins, she whispered her final words to the world. "I am going to be face to face with Jesus now. I love all of you very much." But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible, and what's going to challenge everything you think you know about justice, redemption, and human nature. This isn't the same woman who committed one of Texas's most brutal murders. Before we dive into this incredible story, I need to ask, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, because this case sparked international controversy, and I want to see how global this community really is. The Pope himself pleaded for Karla's life. The European Union formally requested mercy. Even conservative Christian leaders broke ranks to support her. So tell me, are you watching from the US? Europe? Maybe somewhere that doesn't even have the death penalty? I'm genuinely curious. And if this case intrigues you as much as it should, hit that subscribe button, because stories like Karla's are exactly why this channel exists. And honestly, if you're here for true crime content but haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? These are the stories that matter, the ones that don't have easy answers, the ones that force you to question everything you think you know about right and wrong. Because what I'm about to tell you will challenge every assumption you have about justice, redemption, and whether people can truly change. Karla Faye Tucker went from being a drug-addicted killer who took sexual pleasure in murder to becoming a minister, a wife, and someone who spent her final hours comforting other inmates on death row. The question isn't just what she did, it's who she became, and whether that should have mattered. Let's start from the beginning, because this story will stay with you. November 18th, 1959. Houston, Texas. Karla Faye Tucker is born into what can only be described as a living nightmare. Her father abandons a family when she's still young, leaving her with a mother whose idea of parenting was introducing her 8-year-old daughter to drugs. 8 years old. Think about that for a moment. While most kids that age are learning to ride bikes and doing homework, Karla was getting high with her own mother. The household became a revolving door of dangerous associates, drug dealers, and violent men. There was no structure, no safety, no childhood. By the time she hit her teens, school was a distant memory. She dropped out in 7th grade. Instead of textbooks and teachers, her education came from Houston's underground world of heroin, speed, and motorcycle gangs. Her teenage marriage was a desperate attempt to find stability. But how do you build a life when both partners are too damaged and addicted to function? It crumbled almost immediately. That's when she met Danny Garrett, a man who shared her addiction and her taste for the dangerous lifestyle that came with it. Together, they spiraled deeper into a world of petty crime and drug dealing. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared anyone for what would happen on June 13th, 1983. June 13th, 1983. A date that would be burned into Texas criminal history forever. Karla, Danny Garrett, and a friend decided to break into Jerry Lynn Dean's Houston apartment. It started as something simple. Dean allegedly owed them money for motorcycle parts. Just a burglary. Get in, take what they were owed, get out. But nothing about that night would be simple. They found a pickaxe in the apartment. And what happened next would shock even the most hardened homicide detectives who had seen it all. The dispute escalated into an argument, then into violence, then into something far more sinister and brutal than anyone could have imagined. Jerry Lynn Dean was struck repeatedly with that pickaxe. But he wasn't alone that night. Deborah Thornton had been staying over, and she became the second victim in what can only be described as a frenzied, relentless attack. This wasn't a quick killing. This wasn't a moment of rage that ended swiftly. The violence was persistent, methodical, and absolutely savage. Both victims were struck multiple times as they lay helpless. But here's what made this case different from every other brutal murder that crossed the desks of Houston homicide detectives. What made seasoned investigators struggle to sleep at night wasn't just the violence itself. It was what Karla would later confess about how that violence made her feel. When Karla Faye Tucker was arrested days later, her confession came quickly. Too quickly for investigators who expected denials, lawyers, and legal maneuvering. But what she told them in that interrogation room would haunt everyone present for the rest of their careers. Tucker didn't just admit to the murders. She described experiencing sexual excitement and gratification with each blow of the pickaxe. She spoke about the sadistic pleasure that accompanied the violence, as if she was describing a thrilling experience rather than the brutal taking of two human lives. Seasoned detectives, men and women who had investigated countless homicides, who thought they'd seen every kind of human depravity, were visibly shaken. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't even a robbery gone wrong. This was something darker, something that suggested a level of calculated cruelty that defied understanding. Her confession became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, but more than that, it became the thing that would follow her for the next 14 years. Every appeal, every clemency hearing, every interview, those words would echo. Because how do you look past that? How do you see redemption in someone who found sexual pleasure in murder? Well, as impossible as it seems, Karla Faye Tucker was about to become living proof that people can change in the most extraordinary ways. The trial that would seal Karla Faye Tucker's fate was swift and brutal in its efficiency. With her detailed confession already on record, the defense had virtually nothing to work with. They tried desperately to present mitigating factors: her horrific childhood, the severe drug addiction, and the cycle of abuse that had shaped her entire life. But when you're sitting across from a jury who's heard about someone taking sexual pleasure in murder, sympathy becomes a scarce commodity. The prosecution painted her exactly as her confession suggested: a remorseless killer who had found gratification in the act of taking human life. They didn't need to embellish. Her own words were damning enough. The verdict came quickly: guilty of capital murder. The sentence followed just as fast: death by lethal injection. At just 24 years old, Karla Faye Tucker joined the small, exclusive group of women on Texas death row. Most people expected her to disappear into the system, becoming another forgotten name on a list of condemned killers waiting for their appeals to run out. But Karla Faye Tucker was about to do something that no one, not the prosecutors, not the guards, not even her own lawyers, saw coming. Within months of arriving on death row, something extraordinary began to happen. Guards noticed it first. The hard, drug-addicted woman who had confessed to sexual gratification during murder was different, quieter, more thoughtful. She started reading, not just magazines or novels, but religious texts. The Bible became a constant companion. At first, everyone was skeptical. Prison conversions are common, especially on death row. Inmates facing execution suddenly find God with remarkable frequency, usually right around appeal time. The guards had seen it all before: the desperate pleas of heaven, the sudden religious devotion that appeared whenever lawyers filed motions. But this felt different. Tucker began attending every religious service available. She asked thoughtful questions about scripture, engaged in deep theological discussions with chaplains, and most surprising of all, she started reaching out to other inmates, not to complain about her situation or plot appeals, but to offer comfort and spiritual guidance. The woman who had once found pleasure in taking life was now dedicating herself to helping others find meaning in theirs. Fellow inmates noticed a change too. In a place where manipulation and fake personas are survival tools, authenticity stands out. and what they were seeing from Karla Faye Tucker seemed genuine. Now here's where this story takes a turn that'll make you question everything you think you know about justice and redemption. But before I continue, I have to ask, are you Team Redemption or Team Justice? Because what happens next will test every moral boundary you have. Let me know in the comments. And while you're there, smash that like button, because this story deserves to be heard. Because over the next several years, Karla's transformation became impossible to ignore. Prison psychologists documented dramatic personality changes. Chaplains vouched for her spiritual growth. Even the most cynical guards, people trained to spot manipulation and fake behavior, began to believe that something genuine was happening. She wasn't just reading scripture, she was living it. She wasn't just talking about redemption. She was demonstrating it daily through her interactions with staff and fellow inmates. By the early 1990s, the woman sitting in that Texas prison cell bore almost no resemblance to the drug-addicted killer who had entered the system nearly a decade earlier. The question everyone was starting to ask was simple but profound. If someone can truly change, what does that mean for justice? "14 years. That's how long Karla Faye Tucker spent on death row. And by the mid-1990s, the transformation was complete and undeniable. The woman who gave interviews from her cell spoke with an eloquence and depth that stunned journalists. Gone was the crude, drug-addicted killer. In her place sat someone who could discuss complex theological concepts, speak thoughtfully about mercy and justice, and articulate profound remorse in ways that seemed impossible from someone who had once described sexual pleasure during murder. "I am not the same person who came to prison 14 years ago," she would tell interviewers, and the evidence supported her claim. Her vocabulary had expanded dramatically. Her demeanor was calm, thoughtful, and genuinely peaceful. She spoke about her crimes with a horror and remorse that appeared completely authentic. But perhaps the most remarkable quote came when she discussed the concept of mercy itself. "I don't really understand the guidelines for mercy, but I know that mercy is given to those who don't deserve it." These weren't the words of someone trying to manipulate the system. These were the reflections of someone who had spent years wrestling with the magnitude of what she had done. Prison officials noted that she had become a stabilizing presence on death row. Other inmates sought her counsel. She mediated disputes, offered comfort to the distressed, and had become an unofficial minister to some of the most dangerous people in Texas. In 1995, something happened that shocked everyone who knew Karla's story. She got married. Dana Brown was a prison minister who had been counseling her for years. What started as spiritual guidance had evolved into something deeper. A genuine love story conducted entirely through prison visits and letters. Think about that for a moment. A man fell in love with a woman on death row, knowing she would likely never leave that prison alive. Their entire relationship existed within the confines of supervised visits and written correspondence. Yet those who witnessed their interactions described it as profoundly spiritual and authentic. Brown didn't just marry Karla. He became one of her most passionate advocates, insisting that the woman he loved bore no resemblance to the person who had committed those brutal murders. But the marriage was just one part of her transformation. Karla had officially become a minister herself, licensed to perform religious ceremonies and provide spiritual counsel. She conducted Bible studies, led prayer groups, and had essentially become the spiritual heart of the women's death row unit. Other inmates would seek her out during their darkest moments. Guards reported that she spent hours talking women through suicidal thoughts, family crises, and the psychological torment that comes with facing execution. She had transformed from someone who took life to someone who was dedicated to preserving and improving it. The irony was impossible to ignore. Texas's death row had produced one of its most effective ministers. But not everyone was buying the transformation story. Critics argued that Karla's conversion was nothing more than calculated manipulation designed to save her life. They pointed out that death row conversions are common, and that her articulate interviews and spiritual demeanor could easily be an elaborate performance orchestrated by someone desperate to avoid execution. She's had 14 years to perfect this act, skeptics claimed. Of course she's going to say all the right things. Others raised uncomfortable questions about gender and appearance. Would a male killer receive the same level of sympathy and media attention? Would an unattractive defendant generate the same international support? Critics argued that Karla's case proved the justice system treated attractive white women differently than everyone else. The religious community found itself split down the middle. Traditional conservatives believed that earthly consequences should follow regardless of spiritual transformation. That justice demanded her execution, even if her repentance was genuine. Progressive Christians countered that forgiveness and redemption were core tenets of their faith, and that executing someone who had truly changed violated everything they believed about second chances. Even more controversial was the international attention building around her case. Foreign governments and human rights organizations began expressing concern about executing someone who appeared to have undergone genuine rehabilitation. The European Union would eventually issue formal requests for clemency. The question that divided everyone was simple but profound. Does it matter who someone becomes if we can't forget who they were? As her execution date approached, this philosophical battle was about to become very, very real. As Karla's execution date approached, something unprecedented began to happen. An absolutely extraordinary coalition of supporters emerged. People who had never agreed on anything suddenly found themselves on the same side. The most shocking voice came from Pat Robertson, the conservative televangelist who had built his career on law and order politics and traditional Christian values. Robertson stunned his own followers when he publicly broke ranks to support clemency for Karla Faye Tucker. "I believe in the death penalty," Robertson declared, "but this woman has been transformed in a remarkable way." His support sent shockwaves through conservative Christian circles. Here was a man who had never wavered on capital punishment, suddenly arguing that this particular case was different. But Robertson wasn't alone. The coalition that formed around Karla included death penalty abolitionists, conservative Christians, international human rights groups, celebrities, and perhaps most remarkably, some of the very prosecutors and law enforcement officials who had originally sought her execution. These were people who had looked into her eyes during her confession, who had seen the crime scene photographs, and who had argued for the death penalty in court. Now, more than a decade later, they were saying she had genuinely changed and deserved to live. It was a coalition that defied every political and ideological boundary in American society. Then the international community got involved, and that's when this case exploded onto the world stage. Pope John Paul II himself intervened, formally requesting that Texas commute Karla's sentence to life in prison. The Vatican statement emphasized the Catholic Church's position on redemption and the possibility of genuine spiritual transformation. When the Pope speaks on behalf of a condemned killer, the world pays attention. The European Union followed with their own formal request for clemency. Multiple foreign governments expressed concern about executing someone who appeared to have undergone such complete rehabilitation. International human rights organizations made Karla's case a symbol of what they saw as America's barbaric approach to capital punishment. The media circus was unlike anything Texas had ever seen. News crews from around the globe descended on Huntsville. Karla's story was front-page news in London, Paris, and Rome. Television networks produced documentaries. Her case became a lightning rod in international debates about the death penalty. But all of this international pressure created a backlash. Many Texans resented foreign interference in their justice system. Governor George W. Bush found himself caught between unprecedented international pressure and the state's strong support for capital punishment. Bush's position was clear but politically challenging. He would not be swayed by international opinion, but he would carefully consider all the evidence presented in clemency appeals. This is where it gets absolutely wild, and I need you to stay with me because what happens next will blow your mind. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now, because stories as complex and morally challenging are exactly what Not is about. And hit that notification bell, because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. The pressure on Governor Bush was immense. Bianca Jagger became one of Karla's most vocal celebrity advocates. Legal scholars debated whether executing someone who had undergone such apparent transformation served any purpose. Prison officials testified about her positive influence on other inmates. Even some victims' rights advocates found themselves conflicted. The traditional argument for the death penalty, that some people are irredeemably evil, seemed challenged by Karla's 14-year transformation. But Bush faced a fundamental problem. Texas law required him to consider only whether the convicted person posed a future danger to society and whether the punishment fit the crime. Personal transformation, no matter how dramatic, wasn't legally relevant to clemency decisions. As February 3rd, 1998 approached, the world watched to see whether mercy would triumph over justice, or whether the state of Texas would proceed with the execution that had been 14 years in the making. February 3rd, 1998, 6 a.m., Huntsville Unit, Texas. While most of the world was still asleep, Karla Faye Tucker was beginning her final day on Earth. Outside the prison walls, something unprecedented was taking place. Media crews from around the globe had transformed the normally quiet Texas town into an international news center. Satellite trucks lined the streets. Reporters from CNN, BBC, ABC, NBC, and dozens of international outlets prepared for what would become one of the most watched executions in American history. The world was about to witness the first woman executed in Texas since the Civil War, and everyone wanted to be there. Inside the prison, legal teams were making their final, desperate attempts to save Karla's life. Appeals were filed with federal courts. Emergency stays were requested, and lawyers worked frantically on last-minute motions that everyone knew had virtually no chance of success. But what struck prison officials most was Karla's demeanor. Guards expected to find a woman consumed by terror, frantically clinging to hope, maybe even breaking down as the reality of her situation became undeniable. Instead, they found someone who seemed remarkably at peace. She woke early, as was her habit, and immediately began her day with prayer and Bible reading. The same routine she had followed for years, even though this would be the last time she would ever do it. Prison chaplains later reported that she seemed more concerned about comforting other inmates than about her own fate. Even on the morning of her execution, she was ministering to others who were struggling with their own despair. As the day progressed, Karla received her final visitors. The most emotional was her husband, Dana Brown, the prison minister who had fallen in love with her during her transformation. Their final conversation was conducted through prison glass, just as their entire relationship had been. Those who witnessed their goodbye described it as heartbreaking yet peaceful. Dana would later say that even in those final hours, Karla was more concerned about how he would cope with her death than about her own fate. She spent time comforting him, reminding him of their shared faith, and asking him to continue the ministry work they had discussed. Close friends and spiritual advisors also visited throughout the day. Each meeting was described as emotional but remarkably calm, with Karla maintaining the composure and grace that had characterized her transformation. When it came time for her final meal, Karla's choice spoke volumes about who she had become. Gone were any traces of the drug-addicted lifestyle that had once consumed her. Instead, she requested something simple and healthy: a garden salad, fresh peach slices, and a banana. Think about the symbolism of that choice. This was a woman who could have ordered anything, the richest foods, the most indulgent meal imaginable. It was her last opportunity to taste anything earthly, but she chose fresh vegetables and fruit, reflecting the clean, healthy lifestyle she had embraced during her years of transformation. Even her final meal was a testament to how completely she had changed from the person who had committed those brutal murders 15 years earlier. Prison staff noted that she ate slowly and peacefully, as if she had all the time in the world rather than mere hours left to live. As the afternoon wore on, the tension outside the prison became palpable. Protesters gathered, some supporting Karla's execution, others pleading for clemency. The international media continued their wall-to-wall coverage, with reporters providing updates every hour as the execution time approached. Inside, legal teams made their final desperate calls to Governor Bush's office. Appeals were being filed and rejected with increasing frequency. Each denial brought Karla one step closer to the execution chamber, yet she maintained her remarkable composure throughout. Prison chaplains spent hours with her in prayer and meditation. She continued reading scripture, focusing particularly on passages about forgiveness and eternal life. Guards later reported that she seemed to be preparing not just for death, but for what she genuinely believed would be a reunion with Jesus Christ. What made her final hours so extraordinary was the stark contrast with her past. 15 years earlier, this had been a woman consumed by drugs, violence, and sadistic pleasure and murder. Now, she spent her final hours in deep spiritual reflection, offering comfort to others, and facing death with peace that seemed to transcend human understanding. As 6 p.m. approached, the scheduled execution time, there was still a glimmer of hope that Governor Bush might grant last-minute clemency. Phones rang constantly in the prison. Legal teams refreshed their computers obsessively, waiting for any news that might save her life. But the call never came. At 6 p.m., prison officials began the final procedures. Karla Faye Tucker will become the first woman executed in Texas since the Civil War, and the world was watching. Her transformation was about to be tested by the ultimate trial, death itself. "6:15 p.m. The moment everyone had been dreading and anticipating finally arrived. Prison guards escorted Karla Faye Tucker down the corridor that led to the execution chamber. Those who witnessed his final walk later described her demeanor as unnaturally calm. She walked with dignity, her head held high, showing no signs of the terror that would have consumed most people in her situation. Outside the Huntsville unit, the media presence was unlike anything Texas had ever seen for an execution. News helicopters circled overhead. Satellite trucks from major networks around the world transmitted live coverage to millions of viewers. International reporters provided commentary in dozens of languages as the world prepared to witness this historic moment. The execution chamber itself was packed with witnesses, representatives from the media, families of her victims, prison officials, and legal observers. The unprecedented attention meant that every detail of what was about to happen would be scrutinized and analyzed by millions of people across the globe. As Karla was strapped to the gurney, witnesses noted that she continued to display the same peaceful composure that had characterized her entire final day. There was no last-minute breakdown, no desperate pleas for mercy, and no signs of fear that would have been entirely understandable. Instead, she prepared to deliver final words that would be remembered long after her death. When asked if she had any final words, Karla Faye Tucker looked directly at the witnesses and spoke with clarity and composure that stunned everyone present. Her voice was steady, almost serene, as she addressed the families of her victims first. "Yes, sir. I would like to say to all of you, the Thornton family and Jerry Dean's family, that I am so sorry. I hope God will give you peace with this." These words carried extraordinary weight. Here was a woman who had brutally murdered 2 people, who had confessed to taking sexual pleasure in their deaths, now expressing what appeared to be genuine remorse and concern for families she had devastated. But she wasn't finished. Turning her attention to her supporters and loved ones, she continued, "I am going to be face to face with Jesus now. I love all of you very much. I will see you all when you get there. I will wait for you." The contrast was impossible to ignore. 15 years earlier, this woman had described sexual gratification during murder. Now, facing her own death, her final thoughts were about apologizing to victims' families and expressing love for those who had supported her transformation. These would be the last words Karla Faye Tucker would ever speak. As a lethal injection began flowing through the IV lines, witnesses described what happened next as both peaceful and deeply unsettling. Karla continued praising Jesus Christ even as the deadly chemicals entered her system. She licked her lips, looked toward the ceiling, and then began humming softly, a gentle, almost childlike sound that filled the otherwise silent execution chamber. There was no struggle, no gasping for air, and no signs of distress. Her death appeared as peaceful as her demeanor had been throughout her final day. At 6:45 p.m., Karla Faye Tucker was pronounced dead. The immediate aftermath revealed just how deeply divided public opinion remained. Outside the prison, some celebrated what they saw as justice finally being served. Others wept for what they believed was the execution of a genuinely redeemed person. International reaction was swift and harsh. European newspapers condemned Texas for executing someone who had clearly transformed. Religious leaders remained split, some praising her peaceful death as evidence of genuine faith, others arguing that earthly consequences must follow regardless of spiritual redemption. Witnesses to her execution struggled to reconcile what they had seen. Here was a woman who had faced death with more grace and composure than most people face ordinary challenges, yet she had committed acts of unspeakable brutality. Her final moments encapsulated the central question her case had posed. Can someone truly change? More than 25 years later, Karla Faye Tucker's execution continues to spark intense debate about the very purpose of capital punishment. Her case fundamentally challenged the traditional understanding of justice. Is the death penalty purely retributive, an eye for an eye, regardless of what someone becomes? Or should it consider the possibility of genuine rehabilitation and transformation? Tucker's story forced America to confront these uncomfortable questions in ways that still resonate today. The international impact was immediate and lasting. Foreign governments used her case as evidence of America's inflexible approach to capital punishment. Human rights organizations pointed to her transformation as proof that even the most brutal killers could change, making execution not just wrong but wasteful. The religious community remained deeply fractured. Progressive Christians saw her peaceful death as validation of their beliefs about redemption and second chances. Conservative believers argued that earthly consequences must follow sin, regardless of spiritual transformation. This theological divide reflected broader questions about mercy, justice, and whether true forgiveness can coexist with ultimate punishment. Legal scholars continue to debate whether transformation should be legally relevant to clemency decisions. Tucker's case highlighted fundamental flaws in how the justice system weighs past crimes against present character, a debate that remains unresolved today. Karla Faye Tucker's story forces us to confront the most difficult questions about justice, mercy, and human nature. So I need to know, after hearing everything, do you believe she deserved to die, or had she truly earned a second chance? This is an easy question, and I honestly want to know what you think. Her case represents the extremes of human experience, from the depths of drug-fueled brutality to the heights of spiritual transformation. Whether you see her execution as justice served or a tragedy of wasted redemption says as much about your own beliefs as it does about her story. The complexity of human nature means there are no simple answers. People can commit unspeakable evil. People can also genuinely change. The question is whether a civilized society can hold both truths simultaneously. If the story moved you, challenged you, or made you think differently about anything, you need to subscribe to Not. We dive deep into cases that matter, cases that make you question everything you thought you knew about right and wrong. And if you want more stories that will keep you up at night thinking, check out our investigation into another controversial death row case. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and remember, the truth is rarely as simple as it seems.